Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us in Eno's latest webinar. I'm Jeff Davis, a senior fellow at the Eno Center for Transportation, founded 99 years ago to explore solutions to traffic-related problems. Today, I am looking forward to a discussion about traffic congestion. Today's presentation is going to summarize a new study entitled A Century of Fighting Traffic Congestion in Los Angeles, 1920 through 2020. Joining us today are the study's authors. Professor Martin Wachs of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy, a legend in the transportation field, who has been contributing to Eno Center work for slightly more than half of our existence. Peter Sebastian Chesney, a PhD candidate in history at UCLA, whose work has focused on transportation in Los Angeles. And Yuheng Huang, a master's candidate in urban and regional planning at UCLA, who is a researcher at its Institute for Transportation Studies. Now, the three of them are going to take turns presenting the findings of their study. And while they're speaking, you can submit questions using the questions function on the GoToWebinar app at any time. And then once they're done, we're going to go to about 15 minutes of question and answer. And of course, you can submit questions during the Q&A as well. Today's presentation, both the video and audio and the spreadsheet will be, the presentation will be available after the fact on the Eno website. And with that, I will turn it over to Marty.
Thank you very much. And may I have the first slide, please? So on the left side, you see the cover image of a new report that was issued last week by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy, dealing with a century of fighting traffic congestion in Los Angeles. What we're doing today is presenting a very short summary of some of its high points. And we invite you to download the report and a timeline that goes with it that graphically shows the events in the history of congestion strategies for Los Angeles. And we will show you the link to which, at which you can get both the timeline and the report at the end of this presentation. The Luskin Center is devoted to bringing historical analysis to current policy questions. And it's very new. This is like the third white paper, and it's developing, and it's becoming a force in Los Angeles policy discussion to make sure that history is remembered as part of current policy debates. May I have the next slide, please? So the motivation for doing this study is that congestion pricing has reached the public debate in Los Angeles now. And as people respond to it, they say things like, well, why should we use congestion pricing? Why don't we just double deck the freeways? Or why don't we just widen the streets and roads? Or why don't we change the traffic signal timing? And the point is to make clear that this debate follows upon 100 years of trying to do those things. Recently, SCAG proposed a pilot test of cordon pricing in West Los Angeles, the community in which I live. Los Angeles Metro, the regional transportation planning agency and operation, SCAG, by the way, is the regional metropolitan planning organization for 6 or 7 counties. LA Metro is just for Los Angeles County, is engaged in a 2-year congestion reduction study that just in the past week has had a number of public meetings and people expressing their opinions about various congestion reduction strategies, including pricing. And of course, congestion pricing proposals are under consideration in New York for decades, and San Francisco and Seattle somewhat more recently. And these are modeled after the acceptance of congestion pricing and its 60-year success, actually 70-year success in Singapore, much shorter, but still successful runs in London, Stockholm, Milan, and elsewhere. So the purpose of this study was to inform ongoing discussion by showing that congestion reduction using many other strategies over a century, a full century, have been generally unsuccessful. The city is still congested. And that road pricing has been proposed as far back as a century ago, but hasn't been tried. And that's to provide background to the ongoing discussion. Could I have the next slide, please? So I think it's important to establish at the beginning that the problem is, as many people around the world would say, is not a love affair of the automobile in Los Angeles. Everybody drives. There's a wonderful scene in the Steve Martin movie where a person drives to his next door neighbor's house, and that's a stereotype about Los Angeles, which factually isn't true. Car ownership is about 1.8 cars per household. That's about the same as Seattle or Cincinnati, Ohio, and those cities are not particularly known as congestion capitals of the world. Vehicle miles of travel per capita is about 22.3 per day. That includes all VMT trucks and cars and Lyft and Uber vehicles and so on, which is about the same as Akron, Ohio, or Beaumont, Texas. Again, not uniquely world renowned for their congestion. And in Los Angeles, transit ridership is the third among all cities in the United States, behind just New York and Chicago. So it's not that we don't use transit at all in Los Angeles. In fact, it's very heavily used. So, and there would be many benefits to increasing transit, and the LA Metro is, in fact, extending its transit routes very aggressively right now, using for sales tax measures that are pretty much financing it locally. But blaming congestion in Los Angeles on a love of the car or inadequate public transit ignores the fact that large cities all over the world experience congestion for centuries, even before the automobile was invented. And certainly Los Angeles did, as did most other well-developed American cities in the era before the automobile. And we say that traffic patterns are due to Los Angeles' unique form, which we describe as dense sprawl. In other words, it has multiple centers distributed around the county, and it has a dense population distribution, which rivals that of New York. In fact, as a metropolitan area, Los Angeles actually has higher population density than the New York metropolitan area. The difference is that in New York, it's concentrated at the center with low density suburbs around the periphery, whereas in Los Angeles, there's moderate density sort of sprawling everywhere. So there are fewer concentrated centers. Next slide, please. And it's been a century that people have been addressing traffic congestion in Los Angeles. People came from other places. The names associated with these quotations that I'm not going to read, the upper one is, a who's who in people who, among people who were doing transportation and city planning in the 1920s. This is the junior Frederick Law Olmsted, the son of the originator of Central Park in New York. And Harlan Bartholomew came from St. Louis. And they came to address traffic congestion in Los Angeles in the 1920s. The lower quotation, I couldn't resist. It's from Miller McClintock, a Yale PhD student who came to Los Angeles as a young man and eventually became the first professor at UCLA, what was later to become UCLA, of transportation engineering and planning. And in both cases, you can clearly see that they were concerned about and addressing traffic congestion way back when, 100 years ago. Next slide, please. And there have been, the way we organized our report is to recognize that there have been a series of applications of different ideas about reducing traffic congestion. And in general, most of them didn't work. They did not reduce traffic congestion as population and economic activity grew. And the most obvious is expanding capacity, widening streets, adding transit routes. The second, each of which we will be talking about briefly, but are developed more fully in the report, regulating traffic, converting streets to one-way operations, prohibiting left turns, prohibiting parking, and so on. Land use planning and control. Los Angeles has over decades and continues to this day to try to address traffic congestion by saying we should put high density near public transit. We should protect low density in certain outlying areas and direct the traffic flows by the pattern of land use and development. information and communications, Waze and Google Apps are the most current, but the use of information to drivers goes back decades and decades, from the time that Los Angeles even had uh, traffic police in blimps looking down with binoculars, sending information to traffic cops on the ground. Ride sharing and telecommuting, encouraging people to double up and triple up, is another strategy that has been around for decades. And in each case, we'll give a brief example or two, and we redirect you to the longer report for more examples. But charging differential prices to influence travel choice, though it was proposed 100 years ago, has been applied only in very few instances in Los Angeles. Next slide, please. So the first strategy, and the most obvious and the most often mentioned, is expanding the capacity to move. And the quotation from the Los Angeles Traffic Commission on the screen in 1922 indicates that we believed at that time that Los Angeles didn't have enough streets in comparison with other major cities and needed to expand the streets. A major street and traffic plan in 1924 proposed widening streets and extending boulevards as far as the Pacific Ocean. And a large part of that was done. At about the same time, there was a comprehensive rapid transit plan for adding subways, and that was generally not done because the voters turned it down. And the debate centered about the question of whether the transportation system, and a rapid transit system in particular, would enhance the accessibility of the downtown area at the expense of the suburban outlying areas, which continued to propose that it be a highway-centered region and should not develop a rapid transit system. The next slide, please. So Miller McClintock argued for more grade separations, more subways, more street capacity, but the opponents argued that building subways would serve the downtown business and land development interests in Los Angeles at the expense of outlying areas. And Clarence Dykstra, who later became the provost at UCLA, was active in this debate, and he argued that building road and transit capacity would only induce more traffic, which is an interesting observation to come in 1924, when we now address induced and latent demand as an important reason for not expanding highway capacity. Nevertheless, the freeways for the region, a regional comprehensive master plan for freeways, was developed and put forward in 1943. And most of the freeways that we see on the ground are, in fact, parts of that plan, which is now quite old and is working reasonably well, though the plan was never fully implemented. From this point on, Yu-Hong will take over and will discuss some of the other strategies that I mentioned, information, for example, and regulation.
Thank you, Marty. And so at the top here, we see a quote from the original 1924 city charter, which had a provision to study traffic. This section was repealed in 1953, well after the 90-day period. And the city charter itself was overhauled wholesale in 1999 and 2000. But we can see that early regulation and study early on to create better flow for vehicles has been a long-time theme of traffic regulation in Los Angeles. So early regulation banned horse-drawn vehicles, quote-unquote low-quality jitneys, which very quickly had an unpopular or negative impression in the press, and even left turns in the city core. And in 1920, the council even tried banning parking in the congested downtown core. But in protest, a caravan of motorists blockaded downtown streets, and this ban was swiftly reversed. The city council continued to put in less stringent bans. So during peak hour and holiday season, when high volumes were expected, parking was not allowed in the downtown core. And some may remember the 1984 LA Olympics, which some contemporary writers think of as when the city solved traffic. And in fact, I found a 2008 piece from Chinese state media that called the 1984 Olympics a traffic miracle. But this was more because of the actions of individuals and businesses who forewent trips, staggered work hours, delayed construction. And so though Mayor Tom Bradley announced a 8-point plan to make traffic flow forever as it had during the Olympics, giving new enforcement powers to the LA Police Department, looking to regulate trucks, even if the plan had been fully implemented, many parts of the plan never saw fruition. In fact, one part of the plan, the LA City hired some outside consultants and found it would likely be illegal to implement. It would likely never have solved congestion completely. Studies at the time even showed that when drivers found the road surprisingly clear during the Olympics, they started to take advantage of the empty roads. And during the last few days, traffic had already ticked up back to pre-Olympic levels. Next slide, please. So we see here on the left a brochure that recommends a plot of land, away from the floods, high up in the hills. The history of Los Angeles's development is tied to its streetcar network's development. The city was busy and choked and dense. Out in the suburbs, you could get healthy light and air. So this decentralization pressure has existed in Los Angeles for a very long time. And on the right, we see Calvin Hamilton's polycentric concept Los Angeles plan from 1970. Some eagle-eyed and familiar with the LA area attendees will find many of these centers familiar. And it was an attempt to fix the jobs housing balance. And many communities have tried to fix the jobs housing balance, but congestion persists nonetheless. Next slide, please. So among other attempts, Proposition U in 1986 cut the amount of development for a commercial and manufacturing zoned land in roughly half. Prop U was put forward ostensibly to reduce congestion, but the effects of the proposition are debated to this day. But it's clear that, like efforts before it, Proposition U hasn't solved the problem of congestion. Changing congestion levels may occur from a wide variety of regional pressures, not just land development. And it's not clear what changing just land use restrictions may have played on street traffic on adjoining streets. SB 50, proposed by State Senator Scott Wiener, pictured right, which failed in 2019 and 2020, which would have allowed higher density near transit, is a continuation of a long and acrimonious debate about congestion and development. Opponents, who are not necessarily opposed to transit investment, have stated that their worries involve greater congestion from greater development. But history suggests that predicting the efforts of SB 50 would be difficult, and that arguments about predicting congestion would be difficult to resolve through present data and analyses. Next slide, please. I'll go through a couple more strategies before handing the presentation off to Peter. The first is information and communication to influence travelers. For those of you less familiar with the term SIG-alert, as I was, it now officially means, according to the California Highway Patrol, any unplanned event that causes the closing of one lane of traffic for 30 minutes or more, as opposed to a planned event like road construction. Excuse the dry definition, but I tried to read it off verbatim. But this term has been with us for a while, with the first radio broadcast alert alerting motorists of traffic conditions in Southern California rolling out in 1955. And within the space of 2 years, LAPD had helicopters in the sky monitoring traffic, and police could inform 16 radio stations of traffic problems or dangerous situations at the push of a button. And in fact, Los Angeles has been early to the travel computing game for some time. LA was the subject of an Office of Naval Research review because it had purchased and programmed a TRW-300 computer to synchronize traffic signals along Sunset Boulevard, what ONR called the nation's first use of a digital computer by a city for traffic signal control. The legacy of that system lives on. The computerized traffic control system was put in place for the 1984 Olympics, called Automated Traffic Surveillance and Control, or ATSAC. In the bottom image, we see the ATSAC control room, and ATSAC continues to this day to monitor congestion and delay and synchronize traffic signals in Los Angeles. We see in the upper left-hand corner here, then Undersecretary and now Secretary of Transportation, Elaine Chow working with an ETAC travel pilot onboard navigation computer. It was part of a pilot set of 25, which communicated with City Hall via two-way radio with data about traffic conditions. And you could zoom in and out to see a map of the surrounding area. This too lives on in a spiritual successor. A contemporary newspaper article from the 90s mentioned its initial trial would be with Caltrans employees and would be to evaluate its usefulness in avoiding congestion. This, fell eventually to SatNav and GPS, and now everybody has their own ETAC travel pilot terminal in the form of smartphone apps like Google and Waze. So next slide, please. In a somewhat related theme, see also Los Angeles has a history of working with telecommuting and ride sharing. So while the technologies may have changed, the sentiments have not. A 1973 program called Commuter Computer tried to arrange carpool rides for participants in the LA area, but the dispersion of origins and destinations and working hours proved too much to overcome. A small number of matches were made, a very small proportion of the total projected numbers of regional commuters. And around at that time as well, futurist and University of Southern California faculty member Jack Niles coined the term telework and suggested that instead of one headquarters, firms consider regional work centers scattered throughout the area. Niles predicted by the end of the 1980s, 6% of workers would be working from home. And while growth was not nearly as dramatic as he anticipated, working from home now accounts for more than 5% of commuters, trailing only carpool and personal vehicle as a method of commute. This number probably has ticked up a lot due to COVID-19. And COVID-19 has dramatically changed the dynamics of working from home, but it's not clear quite yet what the impacts, the long-term impacts will be. Now, it seems good to mention here, before I hand off the presentation to Peter, to say that while these strategies may on their own have failed to solve the congestion problem once and for all, that in no terms means that they did not improve traffic service at all. For example, building a new road may temporarily relieve congestion. We may see more cars moving through that route. But new drivers or drivers that took a parallel route or drivers previously put off by the congestion on that route will now use that route and take advantage of the improved facility, and a new status quo, which will be congested, will develop. And we can see here in the present, looking back, that congestion continues to persist. And with that, I'll hand it off to my colleague, Peter.
Thank you so much, Yu-Hong. Okay, so as my colleagues have just explained, after all these years, recurring traffic delays persist in Los Angeles. However much we Californians say we hate traffic, and my goodness, do we hate it, we hate most of the solutions even more. Added capacity, regulated flows, changed land uses, ride sharing, and more information for drivers have all been tried. More infrastructure is expensive and a threat to the space we desperately need for housing and workplaces. Stricter management is intrusive and a threat to our cherished traditions of privacy and autonomy. But unless we want LA's population growth to stall, we must consider options that take the concerns I mentioned seriously while enabling more mobility in the city. So anyway, I'm going to be talking about three things today. The first is the history of congestion pricing as an idea. Next, I'll talk a little bit about how congestion pricing has been implemented globally and locally. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about congestion pricing and how it can work ethically. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry, and you'll just have to take a brief look at this slide because this is what I just said is a description of this one. Okay, and now to the next one, please. Congestion pricing has been around since a 1920s transatlantic economics debate between a British professor, Arthur Pigou, and an American, Frank Knight. To model these ideas was a grand intellectual exercise, but the significance was mostly theoretical. There was no adequate means for calculating or collecting dynamic fees for the use of popular congested roadways until the advent of portable digital communications technology. Such a future suddenly became imaginable in the 1950s when game theorist and Nobel laureate William Vickrey envisioned variable fares for Metro Washington, D.C. and in the 1960s, when Wilbur Thompson, an urban economics expert, raised the possibility of congestion pricing in psychology today. I want to stress this latter point. Not only advances in so-called technology, but also in psychology, primed us to recognize the potential for this system. In the past, elitists in positions of power, like city halls and ivory towers, have assumed most people lived unexamined lives. This we know not to be true, since psychologists were among the first to prove that people make decisions rationally. They choose between options that cost them more, which might mean more money or more of something else they value, and options that cost them less. Next slide, please. Around the same time Vickrey and Thompson were publishing, British authorities composed 1964's Smead Report, a few lines of which we have quoted in full on this slide. Smead recommended congestion pricing and set standards for how to effect it. Undoubtedly, these ideas were far ahead of their time, but several places have applied them since. The small city-state of Singapore achieved its independence from the British Empire in 1965, a year after Smead. I specify because this new country was the first to put Smead into practice when enacting congestion pricing a decade later. Initially, they enforced an area licensing scheme from the 1970s through the 1990s. Drivers paid a fixed daily fee for a single-use piece of paper they kept on display when driving into the central commercial district. Singapore switched to a usage-based system in 1998, but a few facilities in other world cities made this shift a little earlier. Next slide, please. They have included 3 cities in Norway and California's own Orange County, where the SR91 toll lanes have allowed drivers to install remote transponders to drive at higher speeds at a price that is varied by the time of day since 1995. This scheme was the brainchild of a major development in market-driven economics from the Reagan era. Now, recalling an earlier slide, let me stress the irony that my own dissertation research into car radio broadcast history shows Ronald Reagan himself, on his 1970s radio program, condemned congestion pricing as a zany idea baked up by transit zealots. By the late 1980s, libertarian transportation's perennial gadfly, Bob Poole, wanted investors to capitalize roads improvements in exchange for the right to collect tolls at a profit. His plan came to fruition in Orange County, but in the meantime, congestion pricing has come to 2 other Southern California facilities, each run by Metro, the express lanes on Interstate 10 and Interstate 110. Both have been a popular success with drivers, and their funding has been used to expand bus services along that corridor. But some critics have raised complaints drivers do cheat and pretend to have carpools when they are in fact driving solo. Next slide, please. Looking ahead, Los Angeles is left with a conundrum. Those of us wary of neoliberal thinking tend to worry congestion pricing as an attempt at turning another public service into a for-profit enterprise. We don't want congestion pricing to alienate us, especially those of us with little money to spare, from our entitlements to drive streets or roads for free. To this we respond, we researchers, after a year of historical and transnational research on this debate, that freedom is merely privilege extended unless enjoyed by one and all. Access to these streets depends on car ownership, on being insurable, on having the leisure time to spend in traffic, and on having an able body that can operate a car. Everyone has a right to use the bus too, but when they depend on it, they don't go around saying they've been double taxed. In part, that's because your typical bus rider knows what fares do. If this public service were free, buses would get crowded at peak hours, with riders taking both essential and non-essential trips. That government might serve the public, we use prices to ration access to goods that might otherwise become tragically depleted. Even socially democratic France charges a fee for adults to enter the Louvre Museum. They make an exception for people under 26 who can go for free on Friday evening. But then a huge line forms, even at an hour carefully selected to be when young people might have any number of other things to do. Next slide, please. Now, let's zero in on London, which has had a congestion charge since 2003. I'd like to stress a quote that illustrates why I believe congestion pricing has potential as both an engineering fix and an ethical solution to traffic congestion. The mayor who instituted this system, Labor Party's Red Ken Livingston, was asked about congestion pricing's origins by reporters. He replied, quote, "I nicked the idea from Milton Friedman." I'm sure plenty of you know Friedman, an economist who wanted the privatization of many public goods and services. Livingston and the three of us advocate congestion pricing as long as it's more equitable than what Friedman wanted. When I see traffic, I see the realization of an existing, unfair, unhealthy, and unsustainable system of transportation. Since I don't have a car, I ride LA's buses regularly. That is when I see roads filled with cars, too many with one person in each. They hinder the passage of buses carrying as many as 50 passengers. I have also seen data on the health effects of pollution, much of it from vehicles idling in slow traffic, which hurts the bodies of people and communities living along the busiest corridors in LA. That's where people of color stay well out of their proportion, and their kids grow up with the long-term health effects to prove it. With congestion pricing, we can reduce congestion, but just as importantly, we can also reduce the amount of avoidable driving in our cities and raise revenues for reparative justice. If we charge drivers an appropriate amount, we can keep traffic flowing and get our cities to lessen their impact on the global climate. The planet might very well need a worldwide carbon tax, but local congestion pricing is a sensible and fair early step in that direction. Thank you very much.
Thanks to all three of you. Reminder that you can submit questions for the panel using the questions function on the little sidebar on the little GoToWebinar control panel. I'm going to start off by just asking, in general, many listeners, including myself, up until I read your report last week, view population density and sprawl as the two opposite ends of the same continuum. But Los Angeles is kind of unusual in that it has what your report calls dense sprawl that you mentioned, multiple dense population centers in the same urbanized area. Just can you give an overview of what kind of challenges that the dense sprawl poses for congestion management and traditional ideas of congestion pricing?
This is Marty. If you think about the Los Angeles area, you can almost immediately recognize that major population centers like Pasadena and Long Beach lie outside of the what's widely recognized as the city of Los Angeles. And if Long Beach were not in the orb of Los Angeles, it would be one of the largest cities in the United States. So there's a great deal of traffic within the many centers, but there's also a great deal of traffic between those centers. And that traffic is what we would be regulating to some extent by congestion pricing, just as it's been what we have addressed through the capacity extension. So for example, the Blue Line is a light rail line that connects Long Beach to downtown Los Angeles. And the challenge for congestion pricing, of course, is that these are independent jurisdictions. And if the county is to succeed, it has to get buy-in from very strong governments that are used to making regulations within their own boundaries. And if it's to be successful, it has to be countywide.
All right. We have one question here, just asking in particular for Los Angeles, why is widening of freeways still under consideration after so many decades of failure? I think what they're asking for is kind of a judgment call on induced demand and whether we've reached a tipping point in Los Angeles on that. Any comments?
I don't want to monopolize the conversation. Yuhong, do you have a response?
Sure. So I think I read recently that there are, Metro is still intending on widening a freeway. I think we've reached a point where we need to recognize that there's a limit to what capacity expansions can do in terms of solving congestion as a strategy. And I think that building more freeways, and it's based on what I've read about that project, the harm that freeway may cause through its widening may certainly outweigh the benefits in terms of long-term travel times for commuters, especially since congestion may reassert itself. So I think we need to be very cognizant of the fact that in the past, these strategies worked for a little bit, but then congestion reasserts itself, and that widening freeways in a metropolitan area like Los Angeles causes very real and tremendous harm. So thinking about strategies to think about solving congestion, we may need to stop thinking about these traditional methods of capacity expansion as the end-all be-all of solving congestion.
I would add to that I don't think that there is any plan in Los Angeles to build wholly new freeways through the region as was done in the 1950s and 60s. There are proposals to widen or to adjust capacity on some segments which are identified as bottlenecks. And I think a case can be made for doing selective improvements of that sort, but coupling them with pricing will make them work much better than just widening them.
We've got several different questions on several different specific types of congestion pricing. And I remember from your paper that you do a generalized discussion of various types. And there are different questions on express toll lanes, hot lanes, and cordon pricing. Could you just go over briefly sort of what the congestion pricing options could be for the Los Angeles area, and how, the ones that work in New York City, for example, that might work in New York City or Singapore might not work in Los Angeles because of unusual layout?
Yeah, the standard methods are cordon pricing, which means that you pay a price when you pass over a boundary into a central area, and zone pricing, which means that you pay a price for entering or traveling within a defined zone. And facility pricing is what we have on several freeways in the Los Angeles area now. You pay a price which varies with the time of day to use an uncongested lane instead of the free parallel congested lanes, which, by the way, are these uncongested lanes and the tolled lanes are used to some extent by lower income people and by working people, as well as by rich people who may use them more frequently, but they are of benefit to people of all economic classes and all races and ethnicities. What's unique about Los Angeles, and what is being included in the study being done by LA Metro, is a proposal to examine something that has not been done elsewhere in the world, and that's referred to as corridor pricing. So that if you put a price on peak hour travel on a freeway, what it might do is divert some travel to parallel arterials, which are already also congested. So the exploration includes the possibility of a facility-based charge, and that has not been done anywhere in the United States, and it is under study here now.
Thank you. We've got 3 or 4 different questions on the equity of congestion pricing. Could any of you address that a little bit?
I'd like to suggest that Peter does that. He hasn't responded to a question yet, and he's quite passionate about it.
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Thank you, Marty. Yeah, I mean, I think that the worry about congestion pricing on its face value is very valid, right? I think that if you're a politician and you're dependent on voters, you definitely don't want to be bringing a message to your voters, I'm going to make your life more expensive. But the idea of congestion pricing is to collect monies as part of changing people's behavior, but that's only half of the equation. The other half of the equation is that now the government has money that can be used to make that right for communities that, if impacted by congestion pricing negatively, communities that can be rewarded for living in a place where, in order to make it so that this many people can live here, they can be rewarded for having been subject to this new expense in their lives. And those rewards can take all sorts of forms, and we don't want to, we want to be careful not to promise anything that we can't deliver on long term. But those rewards can take the form of subsidized transportation. They can take the form of subsidies for purchasing vehicles for communities in need. And they can also take the form of just money being given back out. And that's why I use the phrasing reparative justice, that congestion pricing is one of many ways that a situation can be created where a form of reparations can be redistributed to the communities that have been historically most impacted negatively by systems of traffic and transportation engineering.
There's another question that kind of relates to that of environmental equity, and that they ask about how London's congestion charge was also in conjunction with its ultra-low emission zone. Los Angeles is famous not just for its congestion, but also for its smog. So how could potentially congestion pricing be linked to the overall emissions debate in Los Angeles?
I would have to respond to that by saying that the principal focus of environmental and transportation strategy right now is on the reduction of greenhouse gases, that the reduction of what are called traditional pollutants, oxides of nitrogen and hydrocarbons, has been so dramatic from vehicle technology improvements that the focus has shifted to the damage that will be done through global warming of the emission of carbon. And California is moving toward, there was a governor's executive order in the past month to develop a system to get us to entirely zero emissions in new vehicle sales by 2035. So I would argue that congestion pricing isn't the principal strategy by which we should address those particular environmental improvements. It turns out that we have in the past allowed for low emission vehicles, zero emission vehicles, to use high occupancy vehicle and high occupancy vehicle toll lanes at zero price as an incentive for encouraging the use of those cleaner vehicles. Some of us actually don't support that. I don't, particularly because it's what has brought about greater congestion on the high occupancy vehicle lanes as wealthy people buy non-polluting vehicles so that they have more vehicles to use and take advantage of that. I think I would try to avoid that in the evolving strategies.
And do you mind if I follow up? I'll just also recommend a book to anybody who's interested in ecological justice and how it relates to pricing. Jason Moore and Raj Patel have written a book called The History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, published by University of California Press a couple years ago. And one of their points that they make in this book is that a lot of what drives global climate change and ecological destruction in the world is the unnatural cheapness of certain things in the world, including fuel, including oil, which is kept as cheap as it is through a political economy, at least in the United States and in much of the world, that revolves around the need for cheap fuel to be the basis for industrial growth and heavy consumerism. And one of the solutions that they suggest is to make certain things that are too cheap more expensive, to try to get the world to stop consuming at such high rates, which of course leads to climate change, one of the many factors leading to climate change, but I think it's one of the most significant.
We're about out of time. I'm going to have one last question. It sounds to me like LA has tried, or at least seriously considered, almost every kind of imaginable solution over the last century for its congestion problems. In any of your opinion, what was the biggest missed opportunity where LA political leaders had a clear alternate path that was seriously considered that could have made a big difference?
I'm looking at my colleagues. We have a short amount of time, and again, I don't want to monopolize the conversation, but I do think that the failure to build a rail rapid transit system throughout the region in the early decades has had us paying a price for that over many, many more decades. While it's certainly true that New York did not avoid its street congestion by having a well-developed subway system in its early developmental stages, it's also true that there were alternatives available that facilitated higher density development. And I think Los Angeles might have benefited greatly by doing that, which is not to say that we can't still do some of that, but I think historically that would be my reaction.
All right, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you to Marty Wachs, Peter Chesney, Yuheng Huang, and our almost 400 listeners on today's webinar. Our next webinar, What Counts in Mobility? Rethinking Transportation Modeling, will be held on October 21st. As always, don't forget to sign up for Eno Transportation Weekly, edited by yours truly, for regular updates on our work and on other transportation policy matters. And thank everyone very much. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.